Welcome. Thanks for joining on a sunny Friday, 5 p.m. This is a great turnout. We're really excited. My name is David Citron. I'm an affiliate faculty in the departments of Anthropology and Global Health, and also co-direct the Nepal Studies Initiative affiliated with the South Asia Center in the Jackson School of International Studies. And we are thrilled to have Dr. Mark Turin here from the University of British Columbia. I'll be getting a more proper bio and introduction shortly, but I just wanted to say a few words because I've known Mark for quite some time now. And the work that he has been doing both with First Nations communities and communities in the Himalayas more broadly, which I'll speak to today, has been really inspirational in campuses across the country here in the US and of course up in Canada now. Early on, he and his partner, Dr. Sarah Schneiderman, who was here yesterday giving a talk, have done really pioneering work with the Cornell Nepal Study Program, creating collaborations between universities and students and faculty in Nepal and the Himalayas more broadly via Cornell. And then later at the Yale Himalaya Initiative, they were instrumental in starting that at Yale University. And most recently at the University of British Columbia, where they started the UBC Himalaya program. So really just very effective and instrumental in kind of creating these larger collaborations at these institutions, and has been kind of really a model for what we're trying to create here at the University of Washington with the Nepal Studies Initiative. So it's been really great to know Mark and be inspired by his work over the years. So very excited for his talk today. A few people to thank off the bat. The South Asia Center, many departments and institutions help support this with their generous financial contributions. The South Asia Center here in the Jackson School of International Studies, the Department of Anthropology, American Indian Studies, and the Canadian Studies Center especially has been really great in helping coordinate this event. So I'd like to actually invite Nadine Fabi, the Managing Director of the Canadian Studies Center, to introduce Mark a little bit more formally.
Good afternoon, and because I don't, oh, hello, Peter.
Hi. Hi, Mark.
Mark and I actually just met, so I can't give a personal bio, and I'm going to read his bio in a minute, but I want to just say we just had a delightful about 15-minute meeting that I think will lead to much more. And much of what we do, a really key component of what we do at the Canadian Studies Center is we receive our grant from the U.S. Department of Education, which we hope will survive into the near future. Things aren't looking good so well right now. But part of that grant is what's called a Foreign Language and Area Studies grant. Have any of you heard of this grant or benefited from it? So how many of you are FLOSS Fellows? Fantastic. In Indigenous languages? Yes? Which Indigenous language? So you have one of our grants, or one of our fellowships?
Yes.
What is your name?
Well, it was last year.
It was last year, okay. Good to meet you, yeah. So so I'm sorry, what is your name?
David.
David, hi David. So David is one of our Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellows, and one of about probably 10 at this point, that over the last 10 years we began to open up. As Canada, our language is supposed to be French, and it is French that is awarded through the Foreign Language and Area Studies. But as I said, about 10 years ago we started to push to also offer Indigenous languages. And it's a significant challenge because Indigenous languages really aren't taught here at the University of Washington, but several of our students have actually gone to the center where Mark is now heading up. So this is something we really work to push in the center, and colleagues like Sharon Hargis in linguistics have helped us with this initiative, and Russ Hugo in the Language Learning Center. So it's really been terrific. So it's delightful to meet because we're already talking about how can we strengthen the Indigenous language component of what we're offering. But I think at this point there's probably been about 17 individual awards have gone to fellows studying Canadian Indigenous languages, First Nation, Métis, or Inuktitut, the Inuit language. And right now we have 4 students studying the Inuktitut language. So a lot of just wonderful connections. It's so nice to meet you, Mark, and welcome to you to the University of Washington, and I know we will do more. We also realized by our last names that we both come from Italian heritage, so that was also fun to realize. So again, welcome. And for the formal bio, and I do have to read this, so pardon me. Mark Turin is a linguist from Leiden University. He's an anthropologist, a linguist, and a radio presenter. For what radio station?
Mostly BBC.
BBC, okay, fabulous. At the University of British Columbia, and I just have to pause there and say that something else Mark and I talked about is through the center we also have awards. How many undergraduates are here? A couple? We can give you $7,000 to go to the University of British Columbia, and then you can spend more time with Mark, okay? So you just come see me later about that. So we, what was that? Go global. Study abroad. So Mark serves as a chair of the First Nations and Endangered Languages program, the acting director of the university's new Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies. I'm so intrigued by that program. And associate professor of anthropology. Dr. Turin writes and teaches on ethnolinguistics, language endangerment, visual anthropology, digital archives, and fieldwork methodology. He's a co-author of 4 books, 3 travel guides, and editor of 8 volumes, and co-editor of the journal Himalaya. And he edits a series on oral literature. Dr. Turin's recent work has been funded by SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research, I got that wrong, didn't I? Council, no, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, NSF grants, NASA grants, and he serves on the advisory board of Sapiens, which I don't know what that is, you'll have to tell us. So I'd like to welcome Mark to our university and to Seattle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, Nadine, Scott, and the many different units at UW who've come together to make this talk possible. Thank you also for coming this evening. It's a beautiful day out there, and I kind of think we should all be outside rather than inside, so I'm very honored by your presence when you could be out drinking microbreweries and, I don't know, munching on kale chips. So as it is, to have you here is a distinct pleasure. I'm grateful to the immediate hosts that have brought me here, but actually I'd like to offer some deeper words of appreciation for the people who have been the traditional stewards of these lands for so long, the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the many Coast Salish and other peoples who've lived, worked, and dreamed here for generations. And I'll say that because I'm struck that this university does not have, to my knowledge, a standing territorial acknowledgement. The University of British Columbia has a protocol arrangement with the Musqueam First Nation on whose territory our glassy university is built. But I've done a bit of asking around, and I don't believe you have the same here. So colleagues in American Indian Studies have informed me different people have different approaches to acknowledging territory and land. And this article just came out, written by a few colleagues at UBC and beyond. It's a fantastic kind of sociological survey of territorial acknowledgements at Canadian universities, and I recommend it to you if you're interested in these things. So my talk today is kind of broken down into 3 sections, and I'm doing something I've never done before. I'm trying to bring it all together in one talk. So I hope it works, and if it doesn't, please tell me. I'm going to start with some political statements. I kind of hesitate to call them theory. They're assertions and provocations to you. Then I'm going to spend some of the talk talking about my partnerships and work in the Himalayas, and then I'm going to pivot to the Pacific Northwest, where I've been for 3 years now, and I find all kinds of unexpected alliances and synergies in the aspirations and work of communities that I've experienced so far. So I'm really going to talk about the relevance and resilience of Indigenous languages in our increasingly interconnected and sometimes uncomfortably globalized world. These slides represent some of the courses that we teach at UBC, some of the courses that students in our program take, and also exchange students have taken in the past. And an acknowledgement of the central importance and role of language and culture and territory for Indigenous communities should not become some kind of disclaimer that we then move on from, but actually it roots our work at UBC in our program in the relationships with the peoples with whom we have the pleasure of working. And it also gives me and my work direction and meaning to this day. Now, the US and Canadian governments, as with all colonial governments in settler states all over the world, have worked incredibly hard to eliminate and eradicate Indigenous voices for so long. The fact that we have any Indigenous languages left is a triumph and a sign of the resilience of those communities who have asserted and fought back and sometimes done extraordinary things that nobody thought were possible. But over the last 15, 20 years, these very colonial governments have in fact gone through a U-turn. They've started resourcing the very thing that they set out to extinguish for so long. There are now ever more programs that support the documentation, preservation, and revitalization of Indigenous languages. And I think there is a real realignment that's worth celebrating and recognizing, but it's also worth saying that many of my Indigenous colleagues are rather skeptical about this sudden discovery in the importance of Indigenous languages. At the point that they are about to fall off the edge of the Pacific, the Canadian and US governments realize how important they are. Okay, so let's kind of keep that in mind. My presentation today really focuses on several key partnerships and, dare I say it, in a professional setting like this, lasting friendships that have given my work meaning over 2 decades. And I'm going to start, as I say, in the Himalayas and then sort of move on to BC. The photos that I show in this presentation all have the explicit agreement of the individuals who appear, and I'm going to start with this image, which shows the shaman Dirga Bahadur Dumi Rai in the center, reciting his oral narratives for the ethnographer Alban von Stockhausen on the left, and also Chatur Bahadur Rai on the right, a local intellectual from the same community in eastern Nepal in 2006. It was taken by Alban's wife, Marion Wettstein. Many research projects in field linguistics and anthropology are increasingly framed as cooperative and community-based collaborations for social good, at least towards funding agencies and in public declarations of intent. This is a kind of social movement, and I quote here from Lise Dobrin and Josh Bierson, that has brought academic linguistics out of their offices and libraries into a shared public space. Now, in the minds of some scholars who work with speakers of endangered languages, the exercise of documentation has explicit activist, political, and representational components. While nation states continue to discriminate against minority languages and the speakers through legislation, linguists are advocates now and increasingly supporters of speech communities. So descriptive field linguistics has made something of a transition from documentation as salvage work, which sort of set out in the past to reclaim from the debris of modernity some vestiges of imagined indigenous purity, to viewing documentation as real-world, urgent, participatory, and even community-led. But I don't believe that linguists have become political activists or community mobilizers overnight, but many are finding ways to acknowledge that the linguistic riches that we learn from and document during our fieldwork can actually be used and leveraged and deployed in many ways at once. First, the standard professional needs of publication and career advancement. Done. Second, the increasingly stringent requirements imposed by funding agencies to share the research findings and be ethically engaged in the work that you produce. And third, without doubt the most important in my talk and in my work, supporting the speech communities whose languages we've actually had the pleasure and privilege of researching and into whose lives we've inserted ourselves as outsiders. Now, this image shows a research initiative funded by the World Oral Literature Project that I directed for many years, and it shows Ranki on the right, one of the oldest inhabitants of her village in Kerala in India, in Cholakad, and a great source of cultural and linguistic knowledge, sharing her knowledge with 2 community-based field workers who got a grant from our program. So what I'm going to say is that the practice of what I now call parachute linguistics, or hit and publish fieldwork, are losing traction in all sections of the discipline, and that's thanks to many realignments. I would say that extractive linguistics, a kind of data mining approach to language work, is increasingly out and engaged linguistics is in. Linguists cannot and should not work on an indigenous language, but rather work with a speech community, at the community's invitation, and also with their investment and full participation. Such a recalibration, and I think is a true ethical and practical rebalancing, is more necessary when the communities in question have been marginalized, disparaged, relocated, and subjected to waves of social and psychological abuse over decades. But as anthropologists have noted through many decades of contested engagements, dilemmas lie at the heart of these new linguistic partnerships. For one, the act of creating a traditional linguistic object, a grammar, a dictionary, a pedagogical tool, text and corpora, can actually unwittingly reproduce the very same suspect power hierarchy that they set out to dismantle in their work. Second, and even more troubling for heuristically minded language field workers, is that communities and their languages are rarely as bounded as you think. Even though linguists write with great nuance about the spectrum and continuation of articulations that lie between accent and language with everything in the middle, not all linguists have been equally reflective about cultural and ethnic boundaries in communities. Linguistic monographs are still based on meaty chapters on complex verbal morphology and often a wafer-thin one on the people. Right? So too, anthropologists have put in their rather large monographs and ethnographies, often very small chapters on the language. So I think there's something that can be learned in both ways. In fact, we can meet in the middle. But what happens when the people with whom we work and the speakers with whom we have the pleasure of partnering actually turn out to have as many political positions as they have dialects and voices and scripts? And it's precisely this idea of collaboration that I think is central in understanding how we go about working with community members. What happens also if the subjects, thank God, no longer called objects of study, but still regrettably and I think quite problematically referred to as some as consultants or informants. Consultants sounds very World Bankish to me, and informants for somebody from Europe sounds like the people you don't want on your side in the war. So how about research partners? But what happens if these people willingly participate in the very objectification and documentation that you are seeking to disrupt? And they do so for political and strategic ends. What can we do with such willful displays of strategic essentialism? So we're realizing as a community of scholars that collaboration actually works both ways. We are being collaborated with as much as we are collaborating with. And the products of the research, as well as the documenters who are doing it, are being harnessed by speech communities in creative and quite challenging ways. So one important shift has been the necessary inversion of established narratives of expertise, informed consent, and intellectual property. Increasingly, and certainly in the Americas, it's the field workers who are doing the signing of the protocol agreements and the research subject forms with community members who say, you're learning our language on our conditions, in our terms, right? You better honor those relations and those agreements. So we're moving away from the earlier model in which the language consultants signed over the rights of representation and their voices and their verbs to outside expert field workers, towards a framework that repositions linguists and anthropologists as facilitators, trainers, research partners, themselves actually consultants to the community rather than the other way around. And I think this is really interesting because it also disrupts the idea of expertise. This is the most profound transformation that our field has felt in the last 15 years, and it's very unsettling for some. Instead of perceiving this rebalancing to be an assault on academic freedom and authority, I think it's actually a unique opportunity for us all to enter into a conversation that's more respectful, more equitable, and simply more interesting. So this idea of a kind of newly improved, engaged field linguistics, to me, is something that's more balanced, more stable, less prone to misuse, and also it results in better research and lasting partnerships. And as a case in point, I'm actually going to take you on a little journey to the Himalayas before I come back to this part of the world. and talk about a partnership that's lasted 20 years with a historically marginalized community by the name of Tangmi, who live in the central eastern Himalayas in Nepal, eastern India, and also in parts of Bhutan and southern Tibet. So putting it quite directly, when I look back, I went into what I thought was language description and documentation. Somehow I became involved in language conservation along the way. And before I knew it, I was actually working in language revitalization, language mobilization, and resurgence. The Tangmi population is about 40,000 and dispersed across the Himalayan border states of Nepal, India, and southern Tibet and China, as I mentioned. And they speak an indigenous, hitherto under-documented, and mostly unwritten Tibeto-Burman language. And they maintain an indigenous system of shamanic practice. This is where I'm going to take you. This is a map from UNESCO's Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger. Every dot represents a language. Problematic, of course, because not all languages correspond to a dot and not all dots correspond to a language. But still, it shows the incredible linguistic diversity of the Himalayas. About 1/5 of the world's languages are spoken in the Himalayan range, from Afghanistan down to sort of northern Burma, southern China. And eastern Nepal and Bhutan are a site of incredible linguistic diversity. So that's where we're going to go, just fairly close to the border of Tibet. Oh, please come back. These two women, Kanchi on the right, holding her daughter, and her mother, Poidi, it means elder brother's wife, it's always what I called her, and still do to this day, are the best language teachers I've ever had anywhere, in any language that I've ever learned. They're also the most honest instructors you're going to get. No grade inflation in their village. Nobody gets an A. I had the pleasure of learning the Eastern dialect of Tangmi for 2 years before I came to their village and was invited in to spend time there. And I sat down with Poidi's husband and Kanchi's father, who was kind of the headman of the village, Man Bahadur Tami. I'll show a photo of him in a minute. And he said, so you've come to learn our language, that's good. Have you learnt any of it in the other village? I said, I have a little. He said, say something. I did. And his daughter said, that was terrible. That was really bad. You better unpack your bags and stay for a long time. So I did. And she was the only person in the village who corrected me publicly in front of everybody else. Because otherwise, when I said things, people were so happy somebody was taking the time and making the effort to learn their language. They were flattering me with kind of empty compliments and false praise. Oh, when you speak, oh, it's like, the birds in the trees, the wind. And she said, Uncle, all wrong, have to start again. So she was actually kind of keeping me on point the whole time. She was also the only child of her age who didn't go to school. And when I said to her one day, Kanchi, why don't you go to school? She said quite pointedly, who would correct your grammar if I went to school all day? So we came to an arrangement where she would go to school and she could also then correct me in the evenings. But she validated me, she drilled me, she just was a first class and still is first class phonetician. And the intervocalic glottal stop that linguists in the audience will know about, which is kind of hard to do when you're speaking fast and battling with a language, I really couldn't get a handle on it. And she looked at me with pity one day and said, of course you can, because when you hold one of these, Uncle, she spoke not a word of English, she said, you always say, what a bottle. What a bottle. So just say, what a bottle, but say it in our language, and then you'll have your glottal stop. So absolutely formidable language teacher. It was like having your PhD supervisor with you, but just less forgiving. So my progress learning the Tangmi language is very slow. Every success was eroded by another moment of confusion. And it took me the best part of 3 years to learn to tell a joke. And then I told it, but it didn't work. It was grammatically perfect, but it was culturally empty. It took me another year to learn a joke that was actually funny. And I think that point of realizing that you've become grammatically adult, but you're culturally not there yet, was a really interesting point of realization in the work. My biggest challenge actually lay in something else, which was having to expand my memory and deepen my powers of recall. Because we become so accustomed to pen and paper and keyboard, of course, now, that whether it be a shopping list or people's names or kinship terms or whatever it was, I always had to write things down. And that's fine when you're sitting down and you can do that. But when I was walking up collecting photo with grandmother here, also I always called her grandmother, as was correct, and she is Poidi's mother-in-law and Kanchi's grandmother. And she was pointing out local flora and fauna and different plants, animals, place names, toponyms. Every time I would say, oh, can you just say that again and I'll write it down? And she said, kind of with desperation, can't you just remember any of this? I said, actually, no, I really can't. I can't remember the word. I've never heard it before. I have to write down what I think it is and then look it up in my little book. And so this surprise at my kind of limited power of memory was, I think, even more accentuated because I seemed to be otherwise quite able. You know, I could travel the world, come with a laptop, could learn stuff. How could it be that I was so literate, but had somehow forgotten how to remember? Was something about literacy so overwhelming that actually kind of kicked out orality? And this was something that people really battled with in understanding how I worked and what I was doing. And the general consensus was that these knowledge systems were kind of substitutive rather than additive. You couldn't have them all. Of course, you can have them all. And as many of our research partners realized, that they started writing the language down as we came up with a standardized form for it. In fact, you could have it all. But I think the sense was that I actually had to kind of remember how to remember. I had to start again and bring it back into a place of kind of oral and embodied understanding. And that process of remembering was incredibly hard and probably the hardest thing about doing fieldwork in a place like this. And this is Man Bahadur Tami there on the left and also here in the middle, the father of Kanchi and the husband of Poidi. He was a brilliant community linguist and intellectual who served for many years in a Nepali jail for his cultural struggle and battle to be allowed to speak his language. And it soon became clear to me that the community had waited quite a long time for a linguist, and they weren't going to let me mess it up. The Tangmi people and their language had basically been written out of history, written out of the Nepali state's understanding of who its peoples were. An internal colonial system that had erased many indigenous voices. So for political, economic, and representational reasons, the community were very eager to be inscribed on the map and kind of represented through the work. And this is quite a responsibility for an outside young linguist who didn't really realize quite what he was getting into. It's also very different to the context of native North America, where the languages and cultures have had very robust and very long histories of documentation, both by local native intellectuals and leaders as well as by outsiders. So after a decade of research then, I finally produced a 2-volume grammar of the language and brought it back to the community. And here you can see, it was met with some skepticism on the eyes of this young woman who's like, what on earth is this? Why is it in English? How is it going to help me? And why can't I buy it in the village? All very good questions. And I now call it kind of the totally useless dissertation. 1,000 pages long, 10 years of work, and it kind of fell flat in the community. So I was prepared for that, and I thought, okay, I get it. Some years before, I'd started working in partnership through the period of Nepal's political transformation and unrest to develop a locally produced trilingual word list. Okay? So I pre-positioned that knowing that the big book was going to cause political problems. And I'd like to say a few things about this. I had thought that, naively, the process of co-authoring a trilingual word list to be published locally in community, in the accepted orthography for the Tangmi language, which had been discussed through a collaborative process, would somehow offset the fallout from returning with a grammar that was a form of alienation of language, right? But in fact, I think the existence of these two documents in complementary distribution actually heightened the tension. In comparing them, a lot of questions began to be asked. How could I explain the massive difference between 1,000 pages of grammar and this rather flimsy pocketbook that I produced locally in Nepal? What was in that English one that I was leaving out of the local one, right? with the community being shortchanged. And for some speakers, I think, the dissertation had a positive symbolic status. It was a large, heavy book that they could take to the district and the education office and say, look, our language is this big. But it had no practical benefit. It couldn't be mobilized. It was essentially impenetrable. And this little word list, which looks very big here, but is actually much smaller in real life, had practical benefit, but no symbolic use because it was too small and thin. And in fact, the very process of compiling this raises lots of complex issues. 5 main problems came out of this word list. Let me talk about them for a minute. First, authorship. If you can see, maybe it's, at the back it's hard, but my name is there underneath the title and then with Bir Bahadur Tami. I'd like to explain that. Firstly, I've never seen a dictionary that has an author, okay? Because dictionaries aren't really written by anybody, they're compiled. So I proposed that there be no author at all, or the whole community written. And the research collective that built this thing said, oh, no, you don't get it. Your name goes on the front. And I said, really? They said, oh, yes. Because when the shit hits the fan, you're going to take the heat, okay? You're the author, you're responsible. Because this could go really wrong. Because this is a political document. So actually the agreement was that I would kind of be the fall guy for when things went wrong, which they did. And Bir Bahadur Tami, who taught me pretty much everything I know, would be listed as with, which would protect him from major fallout, but also acknowledge his role in the community and in the language teaching. And why is this so political? Well, because which words to include, which script to use, which order to put things in. For those who read the script, the Nagari script, you'll see Nepali is first, Tangmi is second, and then English is third. And the whole debate around orthography and writing system is incredibly complex. I'm happy to get into it during Q&A if there's time and interest in that, but I will simply say that the issue of authorship, of what to call it, a dictionary really, this isn't a dictionary, this is a word list. A dictionary must have some parts of speech, maybe examples, and some kind of context, some metadata around an entry, around a head word. This is simply a word list, but for the community, it was really important to call it a dictionary, right? And to be clear that this was something that could actually be used as well. Which words to include? Very, very political, very complex. How long does a word have to be used in a community before it is kind of domesticated and taken as your own? English, of course, a perfect example of a language that just sort of gobbles up anything in its way and then takes it on as its own and believes that it invented it. So, I mean, Tangmi also does the same, and it's very, very hard to tell people that you think that word is a loan word if it's so important, of course, at a community level for identity and representational purposes. So I'm not going to focus too much on the process because I want to show what happened. This is what happened. Our tiny publication served to catalyze 2 further dictionaries in response within the next 2 years, both solely compiled by native Tangmi speakers without outside support, much larger, much heavier, and much more complete. Rather like one of those fairy tales that kind of just gets bigger and better as it grows. Our little one was a kind of proof of concept, and it seems to have unleashed this lexicographical interest in the community. And also, I think it put something up that could be critiqued, right? It gave a model of how you can go about it, if only to improve on that very model. So it served as a useful kind of proof of concept. And the funny thing about it is that really the gold standard in this work were these large, heavy, monolingual dictionaries, right? Kind of the Oxford English Dictionary of Tangmi. That's what people were aspiring to. And I think the community is making a lot of progress right now towards developing just that. A language internal dictionary, not a bilingual or trilingual one, but one in which you explain your own language through your own language with more complex or more simple words accordingly, right? So that's what the kind of model was. And I think it was extraordinary to see that after centuries of essentially kind of lexical, orthographical invisibility, dictionaries as these practical and political documents were becoming a unit of value. They were impressive, they were powerful, and they also helped position the community to catch the attention of the nation state as it became more kind of inclusive and took stock of its linguistic minorities. So actually I'm teaching a class about this right now, just finished last week. And I never thought I was going to teach actually a class on lexicography. My mother was visiting from London. She said, "What are you teaching this term?" I said, "A class on dictionaries, Mum." She goes, "That sounds so boring. I'd never come to that." But we had a fair number of students who thought it was interesting enough, and some designed dictionaries. Many of our native students actually got the tools and technologies to go back to their communities, work with elders to document their languages and do so robustly. So there's a couple of points from this. I think, firstly, anthropologists know full well, and linguists are learning fast, that partnerships and collaborations are always contested. And they can lead to very practical challenges and conceptual realignments. So the simple refrain of giving back to communities, which you see in grant proposals and research ethics proposals, I think has to be problematized a little bit. You only need to return that which has been taken away. You only need to repatriate because it's been expatriated to begin with, right? If your work is done in collaborative partnership, in situ, you don't need to return because it's never left. And I think increasingly the partnerships that we're seeing emerge are like that. They don't involve a return of data because the data is still kept in community. Second, in all of this complexity lie really interesting research questions that only begin to emerge, only begin to bubble up when you actually engage in a truly ethical conversation. So this process of negotiation, of discussion, is both fulfilling as well as challenging. And then you can transcend these mechanical conversations of cultural return or cultural repatriation to arrive at something that's more finely grained and more sophisticated, and also acknowledges the difficulties and the obstacles along the way. So to fast forward it a little bit, through the process of standardization and community consultation, the Tangmi language then ended up with some agreement across the whole speech community through a process that was as collaborative as the time would permit, and the politics at the time were complex. Tangmi now is a written language with nothing to read. There was an agreed upon writing system, there was an orthography in use, people were using it, but there was no literature. So through an organization based in the capital city of Kathmandu, 2 young literate members of the community attended a workshop together with an artist to write a short novella each. And I show you the covers here. The one on the left is called Rafil Ko Siran, which means the tears in my pillow. And the bottom here is Lipem Yu Dushyang, the day the snow came. And it's hard to convey to an audience like this, as literate as it is in a university, the excitement of seeing your own language in print for the first time. So hardened village elders and shamans, almost always people who had never gone to school and were functionally illiterate, would completely dissolve into tears as they heard their grandchildren reading aloud from a book in their own language for the first time. Because until that point, language and books and literacy and text were alienation. They were the very thing that those communities didn't have, had been used historically to further marginalized communities, or it was through processes of signing documents they didn't understand, that they were expropriated and decoupled from their traditional territories. So this sense that somehow script and literacy and text bundled together actually had a powerful practical and symbolic impact on the community was something that really struck me and has sort of humbled me ever since. It was as if through writing and books, the community had joined the club that they wanted to be part of. At the same time, a group of community language activists and I worked together with a local indigenous artist to design 2 primary level school books in the Tangmi language, reflecting something of the territory in which they lived. So the Nepali national curriculum allows a certain percentage of local content in the school books, but there's no federal support for that in the nation. So they say to communities, you want to put some stuff in the school books, you go ahead and do it. But we won't support it, we won't provide the resources or the printing to do so. And I think the point about national curriculum was that it creates a world in which the indigenous students who come into it don't recognize themselves in the school system. The books don't look like them, don't sound like them. The jobs that are described, the names that people have, are all so functionally different to that which they experience at home. Kind of indigenizing the content, at least in the early years, led to far less dropouts and a lot more retention in school. At the same time, it coincided with a national mandate to hire local teachers. And the trick, I think, was to not only produce a book like this and get it into schools and adult education classes, but to get the stamp of approval from the National Curriculum Office, who signed off on it. And they're now used in government schools. So this story is, I think, one of ever greater penetration. There's a lot of ground to cover, and I don't think I'll talk too much more about it. But I will simply say that this process is cumulative. You can't design a school book without having sorted out issues of writing system. You can't tackle that unless you speak and actually not just study, but speak and engage with the language and the political context of the speakers. And you can't do any of that unless you've got trust and community partnership from the beginning. That's what it's all predicated on. So I'm now going to spend just a few final minutes talking about the province so problematically called British Columbia. It's the ancestral home of more than 60% of Canada's Indigenous languages, and it's an extraordinarily rich and layered linguistic heritage. The languages of BC are globally renowned for their diversity and their grammatical complexity. But the tragic reality is that of the surviving 34 First Nations languages, all of them are endangered, and some very critically so, facing the loss of the last speakers in the next generation. And the loss of any one of these languages, which have flourished for millennia and having passed on from generation to generation orally, is really a total tragedy, and is something that's now been picked up on by the federal government of Canada. In fact, Prime Minister Trudeau recently spoke about a research paper that somebody must have put on his desk, and I'm glad he looked at it, in which there's a very strong correlation between language and well-being. Communities where languages are still being used, where cultural practice is still intact would be a big word, but still strong, are communities that have much better socioeconomic indicators in terms of well-being, youth suicide rates, incarceration. So documenting, preserving, and supporting Indigenous language resurgence is not just for reasons of sort of fluffy happiness and feel-goodery. It's actually strategically and economically useful for a nation to do so, because in fact it's an indicator of other forms of community health, sustainability, and well-being. Over the last couple of years, I've been very privileged to be invited into a research partnership with the Heiltsuk First Nation of Bella Bella, BC. And that dot on the map is Bella Bella. The local joke is that it's so beautiful, they named it twice. And it is very, very beautiful and quite remote to get to Bella Bella, BC. The town, city, village of Bella Bella, this is it. There's a school, a hospital, a community centre, a couple of churches, the Heiltsuk College, chief and council, band offices, and of course residential homes. And it's by BC standards, it's fairly remote. You can get there by plane or by boat, and it takes you a day to get there by boat, or an hour and a half by float plane or fixed plane. The Heiltsuk First Nation have been working on their own language for a very, very long time. And it was interesting to me, when I was invited to join the partnership, I had to go through the Behavioral Research Ethics Board, which is the institutional review board at our university. And I'd served on that committee for a year, so I knew it quite well. But I was still struck by the very colonial mindset that institutional review boards historically operate under. Because one of the questions I had to answer was, I being the researcher, how did you recruit your research team, your collaborators? And I thought about it for a while, and I had to write and say, I'm afraid I didn't. They recruited me. They are the researchers. I'm providing a kind of service or role. I have some role to play, I think, but I have not recruited them. Of course, immediately got flagged and got kicked to the full board for discussion. They realized that this was okay. But the very structures of research fundraising, fund-getting, performance, publication are all predicated on a very different form of research output. So the Heiltsuk language, or Hiltsuk as it's known, is part of the North Wakashan language family. The language is spoken in Bella Bella and also in neighboring Klem too, but increasingly, as economic opportunity has grown in the lower mainland around Vancouver and the region, many elders have come to live in and around Vancouver. So you could probably argue there's more speakers outside of traditional territory now than there are inside. Now these numbers are very problematic, and the community have pushed back against either provincial or federal kind of enumerators who count the number of fluent speakers left. The term understanders is used by our research partners in Bella Bella. They prefer to use that over kind of semi-speakers, which seems somehow like semi-lingual, that it's just a not fullness. And the First Peoples Cultural Council, based in Brentwood Bay on Vancouver Island, are a Crown corporation, Indigenous focused, supporting language, culture, and performing arts in First Nations communities. And they produce every few years a report on the status of First Nations languages in BC. But they follow the same categories that UNESCO and other linguists follow, describing languages on a scale, on a continuum, from extinct to safe, and there's very few safe ones. Increasingly, some of my community partners, as well as sort of activist linguists across the world, are pushing back against these terms. Extinct is rather monodirectional, right? And it borrows very much from the discussions of conservation biology, flora and fauna, where you really can't bring things back when you've lost them. But as we've learned from two recent MacArthur Award winners, Jessie Little-Doe-Baird from Wampanoag in Massachusetts, and also Darrell Baldwin of the Miamia or Miami community in Ohio, they both have brought their languages back from archival recordings, from reel-to-reel tapes, wax cylinders, translations of biblical texts, and those languages they've rolled out back into community. They're being spoken for the first time in generations, right? So the very idea of extinction has to be thought about somewhat differently. Endangered may also be a bit of a trope, but the nearly extinct category here at the bottom, for those who can see it, of Heiltsuk or Hiltsuk, of 32 speakers, is something the community pushed back against quite strongly. Partly because it seems in the funding of such work, the more extinct you are, the closer you are to being extinct, the more chance you can get money. Why is it that communities that have done a terrific job of kind of keeping other languages, particularly English but also French, I mean the beauty of Canada is that there's a provincial and federal mandate to learn either of two colonizing languages in school. Okay, that's quite progressive. But why is it that that those communities who've actually done a good job of barricading themselves out of colonization through language are rewarded by not getting funding because they still have speakers? So there's a kind of race to the bottom on all of this that is really difficult to deal with. Importantly, what I want to say is the Heiltsuk Cultural and Education Center was established in 1980, and it describes itself as the memory bank of the community. And the work that's being done there is truly extraordinary. In 1973, they started through the nation and the chief and council with language and cultural archives, and that kind of grew into the cultural center later, 7 years later. They have hundreds of hours of language recordings, video recordings. They have reel-to-reel. They have traditional youth studies, oral histories, recordings with elders, beautiful art. All of it is in an analog form. And in 1973, the year that I was born, they invited in a Dutch linguist by the name of John Rath. Strangely, and I was not to know this until much later, John Rath was the first student of a professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands, of whom I was the last student for my PhD in the Himalayas. So strangely, we were connected over time to the same kind of mentor. And Dr. Rath is an extraordinary linguist. He worked for many, many years living in the community, working with elders, producing materials, coming up with an orthography. And he developed many instructional booklets for the community and gave language classes. The problem was that I think he was of a generation of linguists who was really in service to the language and not so much the speakers. And it's not so much of a criticism of him, but more a sort of a reflection on the time. His work, and he was trained in classics and other languages, was hard to digest even for the linguistically informed. In those days, the way that you could kind of domesticate the Latin script was by asking Olivetti or some other typewriter company to produce a customized typewriter ball or keyboard for you. And they usually relied on things that were existing in Roman, and they inverted them, flipped them, and kind of drew lines through them or dots underneath them. So Dr. Rath came up with an orthography, a writing system for the Heiltsuk language, which looks like this. And for those who are familiar with languages of this region, Salish, Wakashan, and others, some of these characters and glyphs will be quite familiar. Glottalized, barred, lambdas, and stuff like that. It's a regional thing. At the same time, these resources languished in the community, and it was very, very hard to mobilize them. The result was that while the community instituted language instruction in the community school, nobody really felt comfortable writing the language. Speakers didn't need to write it, and learners didn't know how to write it. And the result of this early engagement with a really world-class linguist has been oral language transmission, making a virtue of a necessity. They use the total physical response method and other forms of language instruction. Many of them are very effective, but it involves students pointing and occasionally drawing out the characters. And there was one font that had been developed, paid for by the community, interestingly with some support from the Summer Institute of Linguistics, SIL, that will be known to some of you. And it was a non-Unicode font. What that simply means is you can't easily share it. You've got to have the font installed to be able to read it. If you don't have the font installed and somebody sends you an email, an attachment, and you open it, it looks like Zap Dingbats or something like that. It's not readable, right? So what people were doing when we got up there was, and this is one of the few documents actually that has that Heiltsuk font in non-Unicode format. Every computer in the school had to be installed with that font. When a new operating system came along, it collapsed again. They have a number of digital resources in the language. But people were sharing them over social media and over email by taking screenshots and sending a gift to each other. That was the way the language was being used. So we realized actually we had a simple opportunity through a partnership agreement, which we did, to try and find ways to support the community with all of the work that had already been done, massive description, great recordings, putting it together. It was a kind of an integrated approach. So in 2016, we signed a memorandum of understanding between the First Nation and UBC. And this is very carefully crafted language at the community's request. And this is what we were going to do. Collaboratively create new opportunities for speaking, writing, and reading the Heiltsuk language by expanding and deepening existing community language revitalization and cultural documentation in a digital environment. We bring together staff, faculty, and students in Bella Bella and in Vancouver to actually do this work. And I was just mentioning to Nadine earlier and others that there are opportunities to take students into community and do this kind of work at the invitation of our Indigenous hosts. So this is a UBC-funded trip to Bella Bella last summer, funded by an extraordinary grant program called the Remote Communities-Based Learning Fund. You're not allowed to get there by road, but what else you do, they don't really care. They give you money, and you develop a community partnership, preferably with some kind of MOU or agreement. And we went up and worked out that actually there was a lot of things that our students were well trained enough to do, starting with, and this is the list, of all of our partners and participants. Every person here brings so much to the conversation. But the first thing we did was develop, very simply, a Unicode input system. Okay? Many of our community partners got really worried and quite upset. They said, oh my God, like for 40 years we've been dealing with the aftershocks of that last linguist who came and gave us a writing system we haven't been able to use. Does this mean you're going to give us another one? I was like, no, that's not the idea. You've got one, it seems to be okay, let's find a way to use it. Let's find a way to work out whether you can actually input it, right? I mean, basic stuff. So we developed a keyboard input system in partnership, working out where people want the keys, the characters for different glyphs to go on the keyboard. What are the most used glyphs for Mac and for PC? Then we built something, and I got the idea actually from Nepal. Nepal also, I mean, Nepali has been written in many different fonts for a long time, but only more recently has Nepali Unicode been rolled out. So the kind of old digital environment for Nepali and other Himalayan languages was that somebody invented a font, named it after their daughter, put it on a few computers, and that's kind of how language got mobilized. So we built for a while in Nepal, together with others, a whole load of online converters. You could paste in non-Unicode text, press go, and it would spit out Unicode text that you could do other things with. So we built the very same thing, a converter between non-Unicode and Unicode. And you only need to do that once, but pasting into a box and pressing go is fine. What about all those files in PowerPoint and Word that the school teachers had? So one of my students, Aidan Pine, actually developed a script that you could upload the stuff to a server, and it would run the script, a Python script, over all those texts and spit out the same file, but everything's in Unicode, right? So actually that kind of mobilization only has to happen once, because then you have a digital source file that you can actually use in the classroom, online, etc., etc. And the last thing was to take the dictionary that existed in an MS Access database format and through the conversion process, put it online. Now, interestingly, I imagined a lot of potential problems around ethics and access around this, but the community said, no, we want this dictionary online. Everybody else has their dictionaries online, they have apps, they have keyboard systems. We're kind of, again, like the Tangmi were invisible, underrepresented. We want to be part of that conversation, so please get our dictionary online. And this is a 9,000 word dictionary that took 40 years to compile, but to kind of mobilize it into digital space, and it has 1,400 audio files, took only a weekend, right? So it's very, in a way, it's trivial work. It's not substantively exciting work apart from to see the result, right? The result is the mobilization. So one of our main partners in the community is a kind of culture leader and language teacher by the name of Rory Housty. Rory taught language in the Culture and Education Center and now in the Heltzer College. And he's taken to Twitter ever since he's been able to write in Heltzer using the Unicode input system in a really exciting way. So he basically produces kind of tweets of the day. Poor old Twitter, of course, thinks it's Czech. So the technology needs to catch up with Rory. But sometimes he tweets in Heltzer and then with no English translation at all. Sometimes he releases an English translation an hour or two later, let them worry for a little bit and try and puzzle it out. Other times, he actually puts a little video together. Actually, Twitter thinks this one's Vietnamese. So, I mean, I don't think Twitter's caught up with First Nations languages yet, but it's this kind of mobilization through new media that is truly exciting and I think is really kind of galvanizing interest in the community. Rory is doing something which I think is really important in this work, and I'm going to wind up with these thoughts. For so long, communities who are speakers and traditional owners of these languages have been disconnected from them. And in the First Nations Languages program at UBC, where I teach, it's really a big thing for many young people to reconnect with their ancestors' languages. Kind of intergenerational trauma and alienation, dispossession, feelings of guilt, anger, frustration. There are so many obstacles to language learning. And schools aren't always the best places to teach language either. And Rory and his colleagues in community are doing, I think, such important work by making language every day again, right? Just rolling it out and demystifying language and also thereby demystifying the orthography and bringing the whole thing kind of back home. So my final thoughts, really, reflecting on the work that's being done in Indigenous communities in Canada and also in the States, and also the work in the Himalayas that I've been so privileged to be part of, is as follows. I think we have a unique opportunity and a unique challenge before us. I now say with no exaggeration, there are now more professionally trained linguists and anthropologists than there are indigenous languages left spoken on this earth. And we know the most intimate things about Sanskrit and French and English and German, and yet we know still so little about most of the world's indigenous languages. So we need to ask our universities and our governments and philanthropic organizations to support not only documentation and conservation, but also revitalization of endangered languages and the cultural traditions that they transmit, and also to assist us in the digital step, digitizing and mobilizing these historical materials so they don't get stuck in an archive or in a shoebox and then lost when somebody passes away or forgets to remember what's in them. So we need lasting partnerships, we need open standards, we need knowledge networks, communities of practice, so that we can act together in a coordinated way and protect these vanishing voices before they disappear without record. In essence, I think we need more people to know about this and more people to do this work. Thank you. Okay. All right. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yes.
I'm really taken by all this material, and I reflect upon my original experiences of trying to learn Nepali back in the late 1960s. I found somebody who had a copy of a dictionary with a name on it and a grammar, and it was Mirandonk's Modern Gurkhali Grammar and Dictionary. It was designed for British soldiers to command their troops.
Yeah.
And so I learned the non-honorific form of how to speak to troops. And then I said this when I went to Nepal. I never used the honorific. And so I came to see later when I realized my foot was in my mouth, how the cultural context in which you present a language to others really determines how it's used. And I wonder if the same isn't true in Tongmi and languages such as that. There must be a variety of honorifics or ways of speaking to others that you may not initially glean until you make enough mistakes.
It's a fair point and a good question. Yes, I mean, all languages have ways of structuring hierarchy. English does so quite obliquely, right, and therefore we don't think it's there. Other languages, Tibetan is known for its complex honorific structures. Sure, I mean, I think that the way that people learn language also reflects kind of the pedagogical environment of the moment. I mean, the British Gurkha officers to whom you referred, when they first encountered some of the communities like the Thangmi, they didn't think they were worthy to be recruited into the army, which is actually what kept the Thangmi off the radar for so long. And those early documents, those early teaching grammars, were often produced by missionaries, linguists, colonial officers. I mean, there's a slippage between all of those categories. I think, however, there are pedagogically different challenges with teaching and learning historically marginalized languages. Nepali is a national language and it's spoken by millions of people outside the Kingdom of Nepal and now the Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal. It's a language that, in fact, is often thought of as a predator language. It is Nepali that predates on indigenous languages, and the pedagogies needed to bring those indigenous languages back differ from the pedagogies of instruction for Nepali or Tibetan, right? So in a place like Nepal that was never colonized by outside forces, Nepali itself is the colonizing language. And it is Nepali together with English that have produced a perfect storm, which has eclipsed many indigenous languages from traditional areas of use.
What about you mentioned SIL,
yes,
also known as Wycliffe Bible translators. It seemed like their purpose was to produce written materials, mostly the Bible, in those languages. How do you feel about that missionary position?
Yeah, I often joke that some of my best linguists are friends, but the Summer Institute of Linguistics is a really interesting organization because the ones who I have met who've done that work in Nepal and other places, absolutely they're motivated by a religious calling, but they're not always very effective evangelists, but they're very good language workers, and they often learn the language and live with community in a way that researchers often don't have the time to do so. SIL were kicked out of Nepal for some time, and then they came back and were invited in, and they built the Department of Linguistics there. I think there is a slight disconnect, however, and this is something that troubles me. They're committed to language, but language as the vehicle of transmission of a cultural system from somewhere else, right? So they fundamentally do not believe in the link between language and culture. Language can exist to mobilize and transmit the gospel. While I think many anthropologists and linguists believe that language and culture are somehow connected and that you can't sort of decouple them so easily. So I would say that's where the kind of the ethical and intellectual beef lies, which is in culture. Having said that, if it weren't for some of the SIL documents and grammars, we would have very little historical material to work with. And the Pacific Northwest is, filled with documents and translations of scripture, etc., as well as by excellent early anthropologists and Boaz, Sapir, etc. So it's a mixed bag. You can actually do interesting stuff with those Bible translations that they were never designed to do. That's what Jesse Little Dobed did with Wampanoag. And you can, in a way, re-find indigenous voice in things that were never meant to have it. So I think it's not work that I would want to be involved in, but I've been surprised and impressed by how it can be subverted and brought back years later in ways that the original missionary never imagined. Yeah.
So my name is Maya Makarati. I am from Nepal, and I too want to acknowledge what you just said about how Nepal was never colonized, but Nepali language itself was a form of colonization. And I belong to an indigenous group called Mughal, and my grandparents don't speak the language because they were not allowed to speak a Mughal language at the time. But there is this movement going on to revitalize our language too. So that's one thing. And secondly, I here work at the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute with 22 tribal colleges across the country using community-based participatory research approach. So when you talk about collaboration, participation, I'm really happy to hear your work in the Himalayas and hear how you use participatory approaches to work with the countries as partners. And you did not mention this, but for me, what you are doing and what we are trying to do here is a way to decolonize. We are we are creating decolonizing methodologies and theories. Although in the beginning you say you don't want to mention theories.
Yeah.
So it's really, really. I'm really, really impressed by your work, and I hope somehow I can also work with you and Sarah in the work in the Himalayas and also here. And I just want to let you know, and others in this room, that the tribal colleges across the country actually offer language classes in the indigenous languages.
Thank you for your kind words, and also for sharing a little bit about your work. I'd like to learn more about that. I didn't intentionally not say decolonize, but I'm glad you did. And I will say that I've become more sensitive to how it's used. While fundamentally this is a decolonizing approach, an enterprise, and a 20-year relationship, I didn't know that when I started. And at the same time, I also don't believe that by saying it, you necessarily make it true. What I do say, and I do feel, is this work is a form of strategic resistance, right, against the dominant hegemony of monolingualism, or in Canada, coercive bilingualism. But this idea that one language can be all, in all contexts, I think is very enduring and very hard to shake off. So while many of my colleagues are in First Nation studies, First Nations languages, actively involved in decolonizing projects, and they situate themselves in that theoretical frame, and I would certainly align myself with it, I'm quite mindful of a settler scholar, a recent arrival to North America, themselves adopting that very discourse, because I'm not always sure that it's what my native colleagues want to see. I'm on my own journey, which is an aligned journey, and useful in some ways as well. But it's decolonization has become such a trope, at least in our university, that I think the proof is in the pudding for us to actually do the work and demonstrate through our actions and partnerships where that actually goes. Thank you.
I have a question about the dictionary, and I'm
Yeah.
curious if this came up with the language you worked with. Often, among the speech community, there are multiple dialects, and people can be quite proud of their dialect. So we say things this way in this village versus the people over there. When you're creating a dictionary, there's always the danger of reifying a particular form of speech that happen to be people you were exposed to, or just people who are already politically dominant even within that environment. How do you did you attempt to list dialect differences, and if so, how did you find a way to organize that? This is just my own research question. That I
Great,
haven't answered.
great questions. These are all great questions. Thank you. I'll go into it in a sort of layered way. I did try and address it, and not in the little booklet, because that was explicitly for one part of the speech community, and that was one of the main critiques. And one of the other books that came out in response was another dialect or variety. In my own work in English, I've clearly identified two varieties or dialects, and I've throughout my book, I think that's probably why it's so long, each and every time I've tried to indicate both. What to say? You're quite right. Many people, to describe the work that linguists do as documenting and writing the grammar is probably one of the most audacious proclamations of arrogance that I can imagine. Because it's not even a grammar. Sometimes, as you refer to, it's the speech form of the person you hung out with most. It could be a dialect, it could even be a sociolect, it could be a village, it could be one person. It took me 2 years to realize the kinship system in Tangmi changes when the ego, the speaker, is female. Okay? I had just thought there were dialect differences, and I didn't want to believe there was so much variation. And eventually I sat down and I realized that if the speaker is female, the whole kinship system is completely different again. So that's kind of a sign of the kind of inherent sort of male privilege built into a fieldwork scenario where you talk to people who talk to you, and then you reproduce it in a diagram. I think digital lexicography is an opportunity for a multivalence and a multivocality we haven't seen in text. So I've become very interested in how digital dictionaries work, and I'm now involved in a couple of digital dictionary projects, because you can have, firstly, you can choose to facet, say, show me only this variety, or put everything in there. You can have audio files from speakers of different ages, different genders, all contributing variety. And then, of course, with one click of the button, you can flip the whole thing, and rather than English or French to Tangmi or Heltuk, you can make it Heltuk to English, and then you can filter by that variety. So I think that the power of the digital there is offers us affordances and possibilities that text didn't. And then when multimedia gets laid into that, images are very popular now, picture dictionaries as well as audio dictionaries. I think you start to see some interesting unsettling and destabilizing of these very issues of authority and sort of standardization that have dogged print dictionaries for so long. Yeah. So I think it's a partial answer to a very serious question, but I think that whole space is opening up a lot in ways that are very productive and quite timely. Yes?
What you said about indigenizing school book content to tie it into people's real lives and making language every day reminded me of a story that is told by my father, which is not about indigenous languages, but about displaced or migrant people. And I guess my question is, have people started making grocery lists and to-do lists yet? Because my father was educated in where the education system was in English, but he was living in a community of rubber tappers who were nearly all functionally illiterate. And so they learned to read and write in English at school, but it wasn't until he came to the United States in his 30s that he discovered this amazing technique of using writing to make a list of things that you needed to remember when you were going to the store.
Right.
Despite being literate for decades, it had never occurred to him that that you didn't have to memorize that.
Thank you for sharing that story. Yes, okay, so it's the everyday, the list making and the sort of stickies on the fridge and the note to your kid to remember to clean up their room or something. I think the state of many of the languages in BC is they've kind of become like, it's a terrible analogy, but indulge me for a minute, a little bit like Yiddish for many folk who have Yiddish ancestry. It's food, family, words, and ritual, right? I mean, it's sort of ceremony, a few foodstuffs, and kinship terms, basically. And it's trying to get beyond that. I think the very fact now that people can make lists on their phones makes it easier. Because if the technology is an obstacle, I'm not an evangelist for the technology, but if the technology provides another obstacle, there's another reason not to do it. There are movements to have quite immersive camps in indigenous languages for 2-3 weeks, for a month or so, where everything you do is in that language, right? And that would also include list making songs, being on the land, and just struggling and grappling with it. The hard thing is to translate that back into everyday practice again afterwards. So I think there's reason for hope. There's cause for hope in this. At the same time, the problem is the kind of aspiration of fluency, which dogs many a good language program. All the time fixating on fluency as something that you have to attain before you feel you've really gotten somewhere means that, people set themselves up to be disappointed. And the best is the enemy of the good on this stuff. So whether it be Leanne Hinton's work, which I admire a lot for talking about kind of language in the family, and trying to start with 1 or 2 speakers at home and rolling that out slowly. That's the kind of work that needs to be done. Now, for some people, that will involve a shopping list or a list of to-do items. For other people, it'll be about singing a song or getting their children to recognize traditional foods and know the words for them, or call the grandparent by the word for grandparent in the language. So I think people take different approaches to it. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic, and I don't have an easy answer to it. Yes.
So thank you for the talk, and I just wanted to say I'm a fan of yours for like half a decade now, so it's really great to see you in person.
Thank you.
And my question was addressing sort of, I was very struck by the meme that you put up, because it sort of symbolized for me a lot of the ways in which decolonization is, can be, when you're talking about decolonizing and bringing back a language at the same time, you get into this problem where you're talking about like reification of language in a sort of older version of it, an ossified state, something that comes down to you. So I was just interested in the subject of innovation among younger speakers, and how does this, not dialectical in like the spatial sense, but maybe in a temporal sense, how does this what is the hierarchical implications of this, and how does that get managed in sort of like when you're setting up a digital system, and like all the speakers are going to be like young people, except for a very few small group of older people.
Okay, thank you for that question. That's a very big topic in communities where I've worked. Maybe I'll answer it in sort of 3 simple and short parts. Firstly, among the Taimi community, there was a real interest in generating new words for new things. And the language surely was endangered in that intergenerational transmission was beginning to break down. But at the same time, there was a vibrant and dynamic community of speakers who wanted to see the language move into new domains of use. To be clear, there the goal was not to come up with words for email or tweet, but rather for a word for a bus, right? And a city, and those kinds of things, and a radio. And Man Bahadur, who I showed a picture of and spoke about, he was one of the most active producers of new words. But he would do so in a way that he didn't become attached to them. So he would kind of produce one, release it into the community, and see if it stuck. And if it didn't, he'd kind of bring it back again and try another one. So he's very creative, but also very subtle in his understanding of what might have traction. So he came up with words for glasses, Mishik Ban, meaning friend of the eye, and the radio he named Wakebani, which means voice box. And those stuck, but other ones he tried out simply didn't. You know? So I think there was a really productive sense of kind of language engineering in that way. I've been very struck by how many of the partners with whom we work in BC, they look to Hawaii and the Maori communities of Aotearoa for inspiration. I mean, what's happened around language mobilization there is extraordinary, and the battle is not won either, right? But the fact that there's Hawaiian language radio at all times of day, the fact that you can defend your PhD in Maori, Te Reo Maori, these are impressive things, right? So those language communities have gotten to a state where there's no discussion about the importance of having to have words for everything. HDMI cable, I'm sure, as well, right? It's inevitable and it's necessary for language to succeed. Back in Bella Bella, I think people like the idea of innovation, but there's a difference of opinion about what that looks like and what's acceptable. Some of the elders with whom I've worked, and I've heard them speak, talk about the importance of making sure the tones are right. Yeah? Doesn't matter if you introduce new words, but it has to be phonologically and grammatically coherent with consonant with that which went before. Right? Other youth are eager to simplify because it's a complex writing system with a very complex set of kind of morphophonemic categories that indicate tone going this way and that way, and they want to make it easier and sort of bring it back again to something that can be written more easily. So innovation is certainly on the cards, but when you don't have a language authority, which the community doesn't, intentionally, they have never signed up for a language authority, then it's much more of a personal debate around what flies. Other communities who do have established language authorities that report to chief and council or something, they are the conduits for the language to be authenticated, as it were. So in the absence of that, it's a bit of a free-for-all. So I think that's a really important topic as well. Yeah. Thank you. I don't want to exhaust you all.
Well, we've got the room for a little bit. There are plenty of cookies and tea, so please help yourself, and I'm sure Mark will be around to field any other questions. Mm-hmm. But I think just join me one more time thanking Dr. Turin for coming. That was excellent.